When I look at our history, I realize that our history is not negotiable. It's not defined by slavery. It is a profound history, and we need to teach it in honesty. Good evening. Good evening. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight for another edition of the Erudition Network Black History Interactive and Knowledge Session. I am your host, Eddie Phillips, and I want to thank you, whether this is your first time tuning in or you've been with us since the beginning of this erudition journey. I want to thank you for sticking with us, and I am glad that you are here, whether you're watching live or rather you will be joining us or catching us via the recording. It is good to see you. I see my wife is already in here. Thank you, Tina. Good to see you. I really appreciate you all being here. Thank you so much. My family, you need that support. We try to watch each other's programs and make sure at least that we're in the audience, because this is not an easy job. And, when we talk offline about it, trying to create programs and trying to create things for you all out there, it's difficult, but we do it. We do it try to do it every week as much as we possibly can. So this is a space that we have constructed and built for learning, reflection, real conversations, exploring your mental health, your health and wellness, going into our education and our history. So much that is changing in our world, and we need to be able to find a place where we can be educated, where we can feel supported. Our goal here isn't just to share information. We try to explore the history, the stories, the patterns, and the deeper thoughts and things and facts that connect all of us, rather it be looking at history from the past, rather be looking at ways for you to be able to self-soothe, way to live your life in an adroit way. We're trying to do that every week when we come on here for you. And for you who constantly return and join us, we thank you. I really do mean that, for continuing to join in with us as we go down this path. Your feedback, your remarks, your insights, rather we're doing the interactive, rather you come on and you leave a comment or a remark, that is your presence that allows us to continue to do this work and fuels us to have the motivation to do it. And our new viewers, because we are continually getting new viewers, and I greatly welcome you. I'm going to tell you, if you're looking for facts, you are in the right place. If you ever wanted to understand something about history, or you wanted to have a deeper understanding about how to get through this present state that we're in, you are in the right place, because you have come to a place where facts and things matter and they affect us right now. And talking about that, today's topic, I went back and forth on what I wanted to talk about tonight. The last 2 weeks I talked about good men, talking about Black men, but today's topic is another one that requires us to be honest and factual in how we look at things. We're exploring the idea of, why do Black men and women in this country, we see it all through social media, They want us to ally and be allies and help. But why are Black men and women silent when it comes to this immigration issue, to what we're facing right now, historically, in the country? And how did this history, both here in America and even earlier in places in across the Atlantic, in Europe, and even in the present, how do they shape the way that Black America, or Black people across the globe, see it? It shapes the way that we look at solidarity, how we look at survival, how we look at trust, right? Across these communities of color. And I wanted to go into that tonight because it's an important thing for us to look at, historically and present. And I know that there are going to be some who disagree. And I know that this is going to be a very stratified or layered conversation. But I will guarantee you this: everything that I present to you tonight will be rooted in historical fact. It will be rooted in testimonials from lived experience, maybe even mine. And it will open up the questions about equity and unity that are being pushed to the side right now, and we're not really focusing on. So I'm going to ask you, as I often do now, I'm going to ask you to get yourself a notebook, because I may drop names and I may drop things in here that you may want to go look up. You can go back and review. That's the good thing about a recording. And you could go look these names up. But I want you to grab that notebook if you're the type of learner that wants to write things down and you really want to know that what we're talking about is fact, right? And I want us to explore this together. I want us to be respectful, as always, in our chat. And I want you to ask questions. This is an interactive program. Some people say that we open it up this way, but I have to open it up this way because the new viewers, you need to understand, I want your input. I do want your input, positive, negative, whatever it is. If it is foolery, we know how to get around that. But I want you to have questions, and I want you to go deep so that we can have a better understanding of where it is that we're coming from and what it is that we're going through. All right, ladies and gentlemen. So let's get into this. Let me add this one last thing. If you're joining us tonight, and whether you are a return viewer or a new viewer, hey, please drop it in the comments. Let us know that you're here. If you're trying to comment to us on Facebook and you're not seeing your comments here, hey, please make your way over to our YouTube channel. If you haven't subscribed to YouTube, to our channel, do so then. But you should still be able to make your comments on YouTube openly, and we should be able to see it. For whatever reason, Facebook sometimes makes it harder for us to see your comments, and we come through different ways on Facebook. So please, 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 if you have a question that you really want to have heard, go over to our YouTube channel. All right. Today, as I said, we're going to dive into this thing, right? And how immigrant groups have historically been pitted against Black people until they eventually, many of them, move up to what is considered to be a white or acceptable status in society. Let's tackle that first. But we'll also reflect on some of the things that, let's just say, this administration and some others have done, and the false hopes that people have had as they've been hoodwinked in believing some things from alt-right mentalities and even some supremacy. And we really, really, really want to make sure you interact. Please do that. So here's the thing. When we look at Black history before emancipation, before the so-called black and white were fixed into the situation of that this country is in. To understand that, we got to go back before the abolition of slavery, right? We got to look before 1865. There are some rarely talked about facts and events that happened in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries that we can look at and will help to clarify how racial and ethnic divisions became engineered and put Black people at a stratified lower level from others. One key episode, or one key situation that I think we should start with, and I've talked about this before, is Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. 1676. Hello, Eric. Good to see you. Good to see you. Thank you for joining us. Sean Anthony, thank you for joining us. So let's talk about Bacon's Rebellion. Okay. 1676 in Virginia. Now, I know a lot of people, unless you've been on this channel before and have heard me mention it, you probably don't know what Bacon's Rebellion is. Matter of fact, I'd actually, if you're in the audience, tell me how many of you have actually just say, I heard it. I've heard about it before, or I remember you talking about it. But if it's new to you, just say, hey, it's new to me. Please feel free to do that. Bacon's Rebellion, all right, was an armed uprising where European colonists, right, indentured servants, people who had came over here at a lower status, and enslaved Africans. Eric says he remembers me talking about it. That's good, but don't remember the details. So this was I remember Sean Anthony says he remembers talking about it too. Awesome, guys, awesome. But here's the thing. Enslaved Blacks and indentured servants united against what was then the colonial government in Virginia. And in 1676, Black and white people fought together on the same side for their own common interests. This was at a time in early American slavery. This was an extremely precarious situation for the ruling parties, right? And so the ruling class in Virginia, in response, right, they took decisive action. What they did is they hardened the racial caste system. In other words, they pushed, right, to drive a wedge between poor whites and enslaved Black people going forward. And essentially, you know, historians, they try to talk around this. But this is one of the moments in American history where we begin inventing what we now know as American whiteness, American privileged. After Bacon's Rebellion, Virginia passed laws that gave European laborers greater rights and status while furthering, right, pushing enslaved Black people to the bottom and telling people that unless you want to be treated like them, you better understand that you are more like us. And so when you think about that caste system, the restructuring of how we view things here in America, it affected the way our ancestors saw themselves. And it further pushed the diabolical nature of chattel slavery into a deeper, more animalistic, more hindering version. The idea of white versus Black was deliberately clarified in law to prevent multiracial unity, marriage, involvement. That, if you want to ask, as I put the title, that was the barrel. That was the building of the barrel, right? That later you would put your crabs in. And it foreshadowed the whole crabs in the barrel theme that America still pushes upon us today. If you didn't know about Bacon's Rebellion, and it's not something that is taught to you really in history, it's an important fact that people of color should know about, should have learned about. And it's a part of our history, our American history, that is not taught enough. That is not taught enough. It's a striking situation to understand. It wasn't the last time that whites and blacks tried to come together. But laws, systems, institutions push back and push down to keep black and people of color at a certain level. Let's move even into around the 19th century. Still at a time, however, before the abolishment of slavery. But let's look at another thing that you probably have heard about here, but haven't been taught about enough. And that's the role of immigrant labor. I know I've talked about this many times. And the riots in the North during the Civil War, particularly the New York Draft Riots of 1863. Put it in the comments if you've heard me talk about this before. These riots erupted over anger, over furor, right, against the Union draft, as Irish Americans were coming over. And it quickly turned into a race riot, where working class, lower class whites, mostly Irish Americans, took out their anger on black people in the city. Now, they killed rich people too, but they pushed their ideas and their terrors on black men, women, and children. Mobs of Irish immigrants lynched black civilians without any care of law or authority. They burned down buildings. They burned down black orphanages. They hung men, women, and children from lampposts. And why was that? Well, what a lot of it came down to was the fear of competition with free black workers. You see, since the Revolutionary War, some blacks had been freed and were allowed to be workers, right? And some had escaped and found their freedom in the North. And as they populated these cities and these ghettos and these environments, the Irish and the blacks fought for jobs. A businessman would hire a black person for 5 cents. And then in order to drive the price down, he would later go and hire an Irishman for 4 cents. The Irishman would take the job, he'd go work whatever it was, and then in order to drive the price down so he didn't have to pay as much, he'd drive it down to 3 cents. And the black person who was already fighting to have a job would take that job. And this was back and forth. In fact, we know from history that in March 1863, white longshoremen, right, dock workers in New York, and that was a very, very important job. They refused to work with black men, and they rioted. The Irish rioted then, and they beat up black workers. They didn't want to lose their jobs to black labor. We have this in the newspapers of the time. But when the Emancipation Proclamation was announced, and it raised the prospect of black freed people being able to now join the workforce, there was a complete terror in the white working class. And so the idea of that was we have to find a way to let them know what place they own. Add in the fact that the country was still going through a civil war, and that Irishmen were coming off the boats from Ireland were being pulled to go fight for the Union in the Civil War in order to have citizenship. And angry that I have to go fight for the freedom of this black man who's taking my ability to work. Again, it's the pressure of pushing down on a society. Immigrants who were coming over here new saw black people who had been enslaved for hundreds of years as something less than them and demanded that they got more than them. Newly arrived immigrants and Black Americans were being pitted against each other on every level, but especially when it came down to economic competition. And the Irish immigrants, who themselves had been facing discrimination by Anglo-Saxons, by Anglo-Americans, they saw themselves as justified. And they were encouraged to push down that Black person. And that's what they did. To see Black people as their rivals or even enemies was common for them. And so when the draft riots happened, their rage at the draft, their rage at Black people, it was deliberately directed into racial murder. We know, and they always undercut the numbers, that hundreds of Black people died. And as I said, they were lynched in the streets and hung there. And thousands of Black people fled the cities during a time of war to flee into places where they could be pushed back into slavery. But we don't spend time in our history classes really focusing on this situation. But the legacy of the Irish Americans who told and cemented themselves and said, we are not Black. That hostility isn't often shared with us. But up until they were able to get to their place of privilege, I want you to think about that tonight. When we talk about privilege, a lot of people say, well, you're talking about a DEI, a situation like that. But what we're really talking about is history and how history has played out and how it has been used, right? How it has been used and hidden, I should say. How it has been hidden from us to perpetuate and keep things going. Let's remember back to what we talked about earlier, the Bacon Rebellion of 1676. People took something from that. The elites realized that if they created a stricter racial division, they could make people see themselves as something different. And so immigrant groups that came over to America, and even to this day that come over to America, were granted a so-called white privilege status. And the Blacks, or the freemen who had helped to build the country, were left to be slaved and oppressed. What are your thoughts on that? Remember, this is an interactive program. I want your thoughts on that. What are your thoughts on what I just said? Do you agree? Do you think that I'm just stirring a flame? But I gave you the facts. And as I told you, get a notebook, write that down. The Bacon Rebellion of 1676, the Draft Riots of 1863. Go do your own research. Go look it up for yourself. But I want your thoughts right now on what you think about it. Because I want you to understand, I am highlighting these brutal incidents because they set a stage for a reoccurring theme in our history, in our environment, in our community. The situation may have happened in 1676, but we're still dealing with it today. We're still seeing remnants of it today. So I don't want you to just sit here quietly. Sorry about that. Quietly. I want you to think about what it is that we're saying and type in the comments. Leave a thought. Because see, when two marginalized groups, whether they be immigrants from anything and Black people, they should have been united on a common cause. They should have been united to understand that we can do better together. But the powers that be stoked the antagonism between both of them, made them see each other as an enemy. Rather we talk about the colonial era, rather we talk about the era of America, the government of America, laws were passed to give poor Europeans a sense of superiority, a sense of, at least I'm white, I'm better. White ethnic immigrants fought to earn an acceptance. I'm sorry about that. An acceptance, showing that they could keep Black people in their place just like you could. Showing that they could be better just like you, and that they would support the status quo. Yes, as I said, rich people were killed during the draft riots. So it wasn't all just about race, but the rich people that were killed were those who they could get to. And the forces weren't sent into the cities to stop this draft riot. They weren't sent there because of Blacks. They were sent there because the rich were being killed. So again, history shows us that there is no value, and they knew that. The reason why the Irish people who went and decided that they were going to do that, did that, was because they felt, right? They felt that they could. That they could. You guys have no thoughts? You got no thoughts? Anybody got any thoughts? I'm gonna pause here because I really want you guys' thoughts on this. Give me something. You said, I think a lot of sentiment revolves around the lack of respect, rather lack of support from Hispanics regarding BLM. I mean, you may have a point there. You may have a point there, and we're definitely going to get into that as I make my way through this. But I just want us to understand. Sorry, I got a message on my phone I had to respond to. Tina, the rich were killed. The rich were killed. Wow, can you elaborate more about that part? Okay, I can. So as the riots went through the ghetto, so to speak, it got to a point, right, where they made their way into more affluent areas. They went in for and broke into houses and burned down buildings and attacked families. Right? So that did happen. Hold on a moment. So that is, sorry about that. That is what happened. That's the only question that you got? So, all right. It's happened again with immigrants from the continent of Africa, hired for jobs at a fraction of the cost, hired to play African Americans on big screen or less money to play sports. But now they look at us, they ain't Irish. True. Here's the thing. At this time, it was acceptable because folks realized right? That the old divide and conquer strategy. If the lowest people fought against each other, they will never unite against the people at the top, right? And so that was a part of it. Now I got to ask a question. Other than on this program, have you heard anybody talk about the New York Draft Riots, the Bacon Rebellion, and how it plays into where we are right now? Because I'm going to tell you right now, I know these aren't typical high school textbook things that we talk about. So I always want to ask the audience, if it's something that you're getting here, factual, fact-based, I want your thoughts on that. Because we have to look at this. Immigrants who come in, the Irish proved it, others have proved it, even the indigenous to some extent. They gained their status by distancing themselves from blacks. Remember I told you all once before that the indigenous, there were laws placed even in the 1600s that allowed the indigenous, right, to basically be separate from blacks because there was a fear that they would come together and they would topple, right, the colonials. And so there was a big part of that. And so I definitely wanted us to cover that today because this is something that is not based on skin color. It's an assumption, right? It's an assumption that they can do it. Got stuck here for a second. All right. Can you guys still hear me? My computer seemed like it froze there for a second. All right, I'm gonna go as if you can until it rights itself. It seems like it's trying to fix itself. We have to talk about the idea of what is white privilege in America. What is white privilege? This is crucial because if we understand aliens, the white ones, no, we're not. Okay. I hope not. But no, this is crucial because historically, we just keep having these problems. Immigrants come over and they eventually begin to be folded into what they consider to be the white majority, and this idea of separate from black people. A famous case of this is often cited by historians, especially 19th century historians. When the Irish arrived in America by huge numbers, between, I say, the 1830s and up to the 1860s. Many of them, just going into the 1860s, they were fleeing British oppression. They were fleeing famine, even though there is some historical suggestion that it was more oppression than famine. And they were not considered to be fully white, right? At least by Anglo-Protestant American standards. If you look at that movie, Gangs of New York, you will see that. They faced a lot of anti-Irish, anti-Catholic prejudice. And that is true. That is absolutely true. But here's the thing. Observers at the time also noticed that when it came to attitudes on race, how the historians looked at it, the poor Irish in America were even more hostile to black people than whites. In that period, they killed and hurt black people more than any other considered white society at the time. As a matter of fact, in 1843, there is a note written in British newspapers for travelers to the U.S. And it says, and I'm going to pull that up here. The plural class of Irish immigrants in America are greater enemies to the black population. I'm going to say black because they didn't say black, and greater advocates for the continuance of slavery than any other portion of the population. Let's say that again. They were the greater supporter of keeping them down, because in keeping them down, they had a higher status. And I'm not picking on the Irish. I'm just making a point that this is a historical fact. This is what was going on. They oppressed them here. They oppressed them in Europe. And many of them became ardent defenders of slavery. That's why a lot of them fought on the Confederacy side, depending on how they got into the country. And they became, even after slavery, very bitter attackers of Black Americans. And why is that? Because in their minds, they had to knock the Black people down in order to place themselves higher. There's a book by Noel Iskedev that is called How the Irish Became White. I suggest you read that book if you want to disagree with anything that I'm saying here tonight, where he really went in and did a strategic look at what was going on at the time. They realized that white wasn't about color. It was about privilege. And to avoid being permanently at the bottom, and to get that privilege, they had to show that they were an enforcer. They were willing to take the dangerous jobs in the war against these freed Black people. They joined political parties, the Lily White movements, and they proved their loyalty as enforcers, as gang members. And they had the chance. We're white, we'll prove it. We'll make sure. By fighting against Black competition, by creating riots, and by all of these things. So to answer the question of how did the Irish become white? By violently subjugating Blacks. To be fair, you can see that it's true in various forms of media. Heck, even the TV Warriors is presence. Yes, this is a great show, and it does show you it wasn't people, I should say people of color. Because yes, they also did. That's a good point, Sean Anthony. They also attacked Asians. They actually did a lot of that. In Islam's book, he talks about a situation in Philadelphia where Irish workers would literally drive Black workers out of any workplace that they entered, where they would fight and make sure, and that if a employer hired Black laborers, they would strike, they would riot, and then they would go in and they would fight these towns. They formed gangs. They called themselves firefighter clubs. Go watch the movie Gangs in New York. You will see that too. But they terrorized Black neighborhoods. They are the ones who burned down Black churches, homes, businesses. They tried to make areas inhospitable. But these were immigrants. And it was successful. It was successful because Blacks moved out of those areas. And we asked ourselves why we saw Blacks staying in the South, because the North wasn't always any better. And it solidified a split in this country. It solidified a split. And let me clarify, because I've been picking on the Irish for a while right now. It wasn't just the Irish. If you look at the pattern, but the Irish set the standard in the early 1900s. But the Italians came over, did the same thing. The Eastern European Jews came over, did the same thing. The Polish people came over, did the same thing. The Greeks came over, they did the same thing. They all came over with the idea of, will I be accepted as white by American standards? And when they failed the initial test, the way to solidify their ability to have that privilege was to make sure that the black people, other people of color, felt racially inferior. And it pushed the discrimination away from them. Not fully, because as you could see with the Klan and others, they still saw them as less than. But it took a couple of generations, and before you know it, most European ethnic groups, those Jewish people, those Polish people, those Greeks, those Italians, by World War II, let's give that as a striking point, they were pushed into the white mainstream. They were seen as white. They could hold political office. They could write law. And then we started to look at something that is called the religious prejudice. They shifted from what you look like to Catholic, Jewish. But you can still hold places in society, especially after World War II, after the defeat of the Nazis. They solidified these groups as purely privileged Americans. Meanwhile, the black people, who were definitely not white, could never be passed as white, those whose ancestors had slaved to build this country, were pushed down still to the bottom. They got none of the benefits after fighting from all of these wars, rather it be the Revolutionary War, rather it be the Civil War, rather it be the War of 1812, and on and on and on, rather it be World War I or II. They were not allowed to grow. And these are some important points to make here. These are some important points to make here, because I really believe that we don't really get this information because they don't want us to know this information. Did you know that Arab immigrants in the early 1900s, people that came from the Middle East, they went to court? They went to court to fight for privilege so that they could be declared white. I'm not making this up. Many of the first Arab immigrants, Syrians, Lebanese, they came over here and they feared being treated like blacks. They feared being treated like Asians, Chinese, Japanese. And these Arab people petitioned the U.S. government to grant them legal whiteness. And here's the funny part. They did it. They did it. They granted them that because they spoke Arabic, and thus, technically, they weren't Asian. They weren't sure how to classify them, but the Arabs, many of them who came over with money, insisted, hey, we're from the Caucasus region. We're Caucasian. We're white just like you. And the government agreed, making Arabs legally white so that they wouldn't fall on the wrong side of Jim Crow, giving them the ability to own businesses, giving them the ability to do things that black people, again, who had slaved to build this country, giving them rights that they didn't have. They literally avoided the oppressive laws that were holding, and they had just as dark skin, many of them, black people, down by making sure they were counted among whites. Malcolm X once said a friend of his came dressed like an Arab and went into a restaurant in the South, sat at the lunch counter, and was fed with a turban on. And when he asked, he said, he talks about this at his the Ballad of the Bullet speech. And when he asked the person, why can't why won't the blacks come in here? And the woman told him, oh, they don't dare do that. While she fed this man who really was a black American. That's crazy, but it's true. On the flip side, Asians, then the Indians, the Japanese, the Chinese, they tried to make similar arguments, but they got pushed out of court because they said, no, we know who you are. You're not white. Remember, during the 49, when the 49ers went and found gold, Chinese were coming over here and they were finding gold. And they put an exclusion law to get Asians out of here. This is the reality. Sorry, Shannon, I didn't see your comment. Though they never mention Irish inequality in history books, just that every foreigner helped on things like the railroads. Yeah, the Asians who they blew up on the railroads. False allies to what? All this is factual. I want you to look these things up. Because here's the thing. We are told lies and then we are excluded from history as things are going on right now where they try to make us not be able to study our history. These are important conversations we need to have. I know this issue doesn't make you feel good. It's not always supposed to make you feel good. But I want you to understand why Black Americans to this day might be skeptical when new immigrant groups arrive claiming let's be solidarity and join in with us. And time again, they have been usurped by groups and outsiders and folks that come in. But as soon as they find an opportunity, they climb or they push down Black people again in a ladder to get to whiteness or privilege. And Black people notice this pattern. We have seen it time and time again. And it is obvious, right, that we are the only group that could never be considered white by policy, by community, by religion, you name it. No matter how long Black folks have been in America, estimated 400 plus years by now. No matter how long we've been here, there's always that one drop rule. There's always that color line that has kept us at the bottom. And then people tell us, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Why are you so mad? Why are you talking about these things? Meanwhile, the Irish, the Italian, the Jewish, the Polish, and now even the Asian, they're gradually shed their otherness and they join the privilege club. And we saw that during this last election when even some Latinos and Middle Eastern groups did the exact same thing, did not see themselves as people of color. No, everybody can come to America to fight your fake fight. Otherwise, you would have leave America for your so-called fight. Are you fighting for benefits? Okay. If we look at the, I'm going to answer that by saying this. If we look at the civil rights movement, right, led by Black Americans, marching, suffering, crying, and who did it open the door for? Remember, there was a quota system in place in America before World War II. That's the reason why a lot of the Jewish people could not flee from war-torn Europe and died under fascism and Nazism. But it was Black Americans during the civil rights movement who opened up the door for non-white immigration in 1965. How? Because they pushed and picketed for the Immigration and Nationality Act to be passed. And what that did is it abolished the racist national origin quotas that had killed Jews and others by eliminating non-white immigration. But what was the benefit of that? People came over as a result. After 1965, millions of immigrants came from Latin America, Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and so forth. And Black Americans struggled still. They kept fighting to be recognized as equals. But yet, how often do we see some of those immigrant communities turning on us, beating our women in stores, telling us to get out of their restaurants, turning their backs on us, and overlooking Black Americans' struggles and telling them, well, why are you still in the ghetto? Coming here with a resentment for people who have benefited them and allowed them to even be here. It's just the truth. And even across the Atlantic, in Europe, there's this idea of quasi-whitening. Let's get back to the Irish. Let's look at Ireland itself. Under British rule, the Irish were compared to Africans. They were dehumanized by the British. But later, when the Irish Free State formed and the Irish immigrated to the UK and to the US, they eventually got accepted as more white folks. They eventually, took them a while, a few decades, they fit into the society. It is amazing to me that after World War II, whether people came from the former colonies of Britain, say the Caribbean or North African migrants in France, right? They faced harsh racism. They did. But they eventually blended in. They blended in. Rather it be in Europe, rather it be in America. And they fell into the hierarchy of who is the other. And the other always at the bottom of it, Black people of African descent consistently have been kept at the bottom of each of these communities. In the Caribbean, in Europe, in America. It is what it is. And the key point to take away from it is that many immigrant groups that Black Americans might initially sympathize with, give their support to, because we've done that, and see it as a common cause in helping, rather it be women's suffrage, rather it be Jewish plight. It doesn't matter. When we align ourselves with them, we have historically been co-opted, usurped by the allure of white society and white privilege. Because once that is obtained, once the privilege is obtained, they no longer align themselves with the Black struggle. Nothing is more identifying of that, in my opinion, than suffrage. A lot of the suffragists were abolitionists, and they wanted slavery to end. But when the Black man was given the vote, the Elizabeth Cady Statons, the Susan B. Anthonys, they turned on Black people and made some of the most egregious racial statements, because that didn't mean that they saw us as equals. And though I know this history can make you feel weary, And it can make you feel bad. Why should we stick our necks out for people? They don't have our back. We still are a people who have consistently given our support, given our bodies, our lives in wars. But when they created that barrel with the Bacon Rebellion, we've been fighting. And that crab in the barrel concept, which I added in our title, is central. It is important to the discussion that we're having tonight, to the lesson that we're going over tonight. If you have never heard crabs in a barrel, you don't understand what that metaphor is. It's what happens when you put a bunch of crabs in a barrel. Any crab that tries to climb to the top or climb out will be pulled down by the others. And thus no one ever gets out and no one ever escapes. It's a way of looking at a stratified, pressured environment. And this is the infighting and the lack of unity and the oppression that we seem to face with communities over and over again. We have it in our own cultures. There are Blacks who participate in the crabs in the barrel. They don't want anybody to be prosperous, anybody to get out. And then as the external that we're talking about tonight. But here's the thing. What is the real problem here? Is it the crabs that are in the barrel? Let's think outside the box here. What if the crabs were never in the barrel? And they could all go their own way equally. Crabs don't live in barrels. That's not their era of existence. They're trapped in a barrel that someone created to keep them in. And when you're trapped in that barrel, you're desperate. You're in survival mode. You're in competition mode. Because I perceive myself in a stressful environment. And if I don't fight, I'm going to be pushed down to the bottom. What we call it is systemic oppression. That's the barrel. And it forces us to fight amongst ourselves and not see the unity in ourselves. How does that apply to what we're talking about tonight? The Latino community, who so heavily decided and even said some of the most egregious racist things that we don't agree with that because that's not our existence. Who vote for things and vote for situations that don't benefit them. The Southern white who will vote for something that will deny them education, health care, a better society. Some still living without houses. Some who are living in small shacks in the middle of nowhere and voting against their betterment because they feel they're pitted against somebody. They feel, well, I don't get that job because I'm fighting for a diversity slot, which is a lie. This idea that we say, right, that we're doing this to make everybody equal, but we pit everybody against each other to make them unequal. To not give us solidarity. And so we do this crabs in a barrel, fighting with each other, waiting for them to toss all of us, those who are controlling us. I don't say any of this to make any of you mad tonight. But I want you to understand it. I want you to look at the Irish and the black laborers in the 1860s. I want you to look at the dock workers that we talked about. I want you to look at all of that and understand that's why black people typically won't just join you. They're tired. They're tired. Let's talk about another example from where I'm from, Chicago, 1919. They were fighting incoming black migrants during the Great Black Migration. Again, it was an idea of wage competition, of people coming in and working in the meat markets. And after World War I, and after the migration was really, really kicking in, jobs were scarce. In Chicago in 1919, race riots, Red Summer, a lot of black people got killed. And the reason that the riot happened was competition for work in the stockyards. A dirty job. A dirty job. Because blacks were allowed to get equal pay. And some immigrant whites did not like that. And the riot led to many people being killed. Black areas of the city being overrun. And here's the thing. A lot of black people in Chicago don't even know this history. Even though it was well documented. We talk about Black Wall Street, but we don't talk about the riots happened across the country during 1919. And how black people were continually being reminded by immigrants that you are less than. How they became the foot soldiers for supremacy. And we still see it today. Black and Latinos, as Eric was talking about, because we're getting ready, we're coming down. I'm going to extend this a little bit because I don't want to break this part right here. Eric talked about blacks and Latinos, minority groups, as they call them. I don't call them that, but that's what they call them. And how there has always been a tension, right? We see it in our movies, as someone said, see it in our films and our television. There's black Latino, there is black Korean, there's black Asian. There's always these tensions, but they didn't arise from a vacuum. They were constructed. And it's the economic stress and the legacy of this crab in a barrel racial hierarchy. Immigrants are allowed to come over and they get a store in a poor black community, not in a white community, but you can go open up that store in the black neighborhoods. And then you go there feeling with a sense of prejudice. Not all the time, but a lot of times. And you see the black customers as thieves, thugs, people who are less than. There's a book called Not a Country of Immigrants. The author's name escapes me right now. And he talks about how his family migrated over and did not want to be treated as black, even though they were African. And so blacks now have to see people coming into their neighborhoods with these stores that their ancestors, that they couldn't have, tax-free existence and all of these different things, and be treated with disrespect. Watching Asian and Korean or Arab store owners come over and treat them as if they are the problem. We have seen the videos of them fighting and opening up nail shops and jumping on black women. Poverty, racial bias being presented to them as they get their citizenship being taught to them that the blacks were slaves, but really were not the full context. And so you come in looking at them as something else. And so the narrative out there is that black people don't support immigration and that African Americans are anti-immigration and that we don't. But if you examine it critically, if you really look at it, we have always been supportive as a community. But what we do not support is abuse. What we do not support is the decades of people pushing us down. Polls show that almost 70% of Black Americans favor the legal status of what they call the dreamers, the young undocumented immigrants, when they polled them in early 2020 or 2021. A lot of Black people, when polled, saw immigrants as hardworking and deserving a shot. However, it is also true that we saw what happened when people got over and said, as they were voting for the current administration, and said unequivocally, you could go look it up on your YouTubes, your TikToks, and whatever, Black people need to get over it. Black people are the problem. Who turned against Black folks, and sometimes even their own people, with the idea that, well, they're lawbreakers, they're infidels, they're less than, they're the other. And yet again, we saw that twist of people trying to get that white privilege on the backs of Black people. So when we talk about this episode and we say what presents the cautiousness, what seems to be non-support, history, lived experience, talking to our families. We still are at the lower end of jobs, housing, and opportunities, even though we've been here for hundreds of years and have helped to create this country. And every new group that comes in who fights to get that privilege and eventually gets it steps on the Black worker, the Black man, the Black woman. You don't have to agree with me. The studies and the polls and everything have shown that. It's shown that. And it's a sad, sad system. I'm not going to get through all of this tonight, but I wanted to give you all a good start. Lately, as I've delved into more deeper matters, I have found that I'm going to have to break these episodes into two parts. So I hope you join us again next week as we talk about this, because this is a deep issue. And there's no way for me to get everything out to you in the way that I would like to in one episode, not with an hour. But I want you to remember some of the things that we talked about. I want you to remember the idea of the crabs in the barrel. I want you to remember the Bacon Rebellion. I want you to remember the draft riots. I want you to go look these things up. I want you to investigate the history that I'm giving you. Not just take what I'm telling you as, oh, he said it. I want you to go read Noel Ikachev's book, How the Irish Became White. I want you to go look up Not a Nation of Immigrants. Go out there and pull up these things that I mentioned to you tonight so that you can come prepared next week. ready to ask your questions, to dive deeper. Erudition is created with the idea of facts. I take great effort at making sure what I talk about is factual, and it is something that you can go pull up and learn. It's just something that I want you to understand that makes us different than what the other stuff out here is. To that, if you don't go further, I hope that this lesson armed you with knowledge, gave you some insight on a very complex topic. And I hope that the historical facts I gave you give you a crucial step when you are talking to someone who says, well, why don't you support, or why do you feel the way you do? We've seen the patterns. Here's the thing with a pattern. We can choose not to repeat it. Instead of being crab stuck in a barrel, we can decide as groups of people to not live in that barrel. We can be optimistic. I hope that you got something. This has been a very, very good episode, in my opinion. I appreciate all of the comments that we got. I saw Sean Anthony. I saw Eddie came in here. I don't know if I talked about your comment until they received a painful reminder that they'll never be seen as one of them. Yeah, that is a painful reminder. Eric, I appreciate you being here. Even though you guys who were here that were in the back, who were didn't say much of anything, I really, really, really appreciate you. I'm not going to even comment on that FBA versus everybody. I get what you're saying, but that's for another thing when we're going to talk about that FBA, because I get a lot of response to that. But I definitely do appreciate everybody, whether you agree with me or you didn't, or disagree, for you joining. If you learned something today, that's great. Please have your follow-up questions, or leave questions, or drop them in our chat or in our comments, and I promise you I will respond to them. I did not put my banner on here, so I'm going to do that before I get off of here. If you want to support the Erudition Network, support the programs that we provide, the Erudition Network, Black History and Knowledge session, or even the Adroit Living, which we do on here. My wife is on Mondays. You can do so through the Erudition Network, $, the Erudition Network. That is our Cash App. Everything that you provide goes into our technical stuff and what we do, our website and everything, and books and things that we write. It helps us to do what we're doing. We greatly appreciate that. But if there are no further questions, if there are no further comments, I'm going to get out of here. My wife says that I close like I'm Kojic, like I'm in the church, which is true, because I'm always hoping or looking to see if somebody's going to drop something here at the last moment. But I've actually extended this broadcast about 15 minutes longer than we usually do. So I'm going to get out of here. You all be blessed. Have a great rest of your weekend. And God willing, we will see you next week on another episode of this. Drop your questions, comments, or concerns in our remark session on YouTube. As I said, we will definitely respond to that. Until then, hey, see you guys later. Have a good one.